Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Slice of the Reef, our new podcast that demystifies the art of saltwater fish keeping. My name is Billy.
And I'm Giancarlo, aka Banana or Fishy Fish. We're going to be your guides today into the amazing world beneath the waves, but also in the box in your living room. Crazy, huh?
Enjoy and easy reefing. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the second episode of podcast. We record every Tuesday, approximately, live in our Discord server, discard.gg/aquariums. I forgot how to say Discord. Discard. And then podcast episodes will go live every Thursday or Friday, depending on how quickly we can edit them, on your podcatcher apps. We talk about reefing. My name is Billy. I've been in the aquarium hobby for 6 years. Banana's been in the hobby for much longer, but he's more focused on reefing. So we're relatively experienced, and more importantly, we've helped a lot of people start their first reef. So the topic we're going to talk about today is Beginner's Reefing 101. We're going to talk about some of the easy traps you can fall into when you're starting your first reef, different issues that almost everyone will have, and other things that beginners need to know when they're starting a new fish tank. But first, before we go into our topic of the week, we like to talk about updates of our own hobbies. So Banana, how's your fish tank going?
Hey, my tank it's going all right. I'm doing some experimentation right now with nutrients. So I'm seeing how things handle lower nutrients, because I've noticed the growth is really well. Like, it was growing coral is growing faster with the higher nutrients that we had. But at the same time, as I'm climbing the nutrient ladder, I realize that some of the SPS, despite their growth, are browning out a little bit. So I'm trying to reach a lower nutrient level and sort of experimenting with that for next month to see if we can get that color back, or find a point where we get the growth and the color, both of them. We can talk more about nutrients in a future episode, but I've also noticed a few things with a specific coral in my tank and the way they're reacting to the lower nutrients, and it's actually pretty interesting.
Very cool. That's awesome. My fish tank is going well. I just left it for 3 days with no issues. I did just get a second Percula clownfish for my anemone tank, my little 8-gallon. And they bonded right away, thank God. I got a pair of just random, basic true Perculas, wild caught, and they were way closer in size than I thought they were. So they fought like crazy until I separated them. So now there's a bachelor living in my 50-gallon, and I have a pair of Perculas that are much more size appropriate. The funny thing is, though, my bigger clownfish, the female, or eventually female, is captive bred, so she doesn't know how to host an anemone. So right now she's hovering above the male and watching him host the anemone, being like, hey, what's that all about? But yeah, that's going really well. The one issue I have in that tank is it's a nano tank, so of course algae and dinos are going crazy. But that's an easy fix, and I think we're going to talk about solving problems like that in today's episode. So it's a really easy segue.
So it's going to be a really good one. This week, we're going to be talking about something that a lot of people don't think about until after they're in the hobby. So they've been doing this for a while, then they're like, hold on, I should have done that differently, Basically, we're going to talk about things that you should look out for as a beginner. Things that when you're first starting your first tank, or when you're, looking at getting a tank, when you're first learning about the kinds of coral and inverts that are out there. Things we wish we'd known that would have made things a lot easier.
These are wisdom that can only really be gained by either making the mistakes yourself or listening to someone who has made those mistakes for you, so you don't have to do it again.
Yeah.
And luckily, I've made all those mistakes, and Banana has probably proactively learned about them. That's part of the hobby is stumbling a little bit and learning. But now that you listen to our podcast, you will stumble less than most people do when they start their first Nemo tank.
Yeah, I've made a hell of mistakes. I love making mistakes. I just hate the cost of making a mistake. You know what I mean?
I want to make mistakes with zero consequences. That would be great.
Basically.
But if there's no consequences, you don't learn because your brain doesn't add any weight to it.
True. That's fair. That is very fair. Yeah. So let's get into it. Beginning the reef. Personally, and I lucked out of this one. But one of the things that I'll throw out there is don't start with a small tank. You're gonna have issues that will drive you crazy. And I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying you're not going to have a successful tank. I'm not saying that if you ignore the things that we say here, you're not going to like enjoy the hobby or you're going to want to get out of it. But I'm saying that things will get drastically easier if when you first start your saltwater tank, you don't start with a small tank. And by that, I mean, like, I think 40 is the perfect size to start with.
Gallons.
Yeah, 40 gallons. 40 gallons or X amount of liters for the non-American listeners.
There's a kind of nervousness that comes along with starting a bigger tank as your first tank. But the moment that tank is in your house, it shrinks in size. It looks a lot bigger in the LFS than it looks in your home.
Yeah.
It looks a lot bigger in your car than it looks in your home. And the only thing that scales up difficulty-wise when you're getting a bigger tank is getting enough water to actually fill it that first time. After that one little learning curve, it's 10 times easier to keep a larger volume of water stable and cycled and healthy than it is to keep a tiny little bitty.
And liberating too. Like you're not just limited to one or two fish. You're not just limited to a few coral or like a square foot of rock that you can put coral on. You have access to so many more fish, many more inverts, many more just livestock altogether. You know, like I wouldn't ever recommend you put a turbo snail in anything less than a 5 gallon, but you can keep several in the 40. And by several I mean like 2 or 3. I want to keep 10 turbos in the 40 gallon.
Yeah, because even your cleanup crew, I mean, the reason people like cleanup crew so much is because they're told that the bioload is negligible, but it's all relative, right? Like a turbo snail's bioload in 40 gallons is basically zero. A turbo snail's bioload in a 5-gallon pico tank it's going to poop so much and you're going to see all of it. You don't want to just watch a snail poop. That's not why you're in the hobby.
I know cycles take longer for a bigger tank, but it's a lot more rewarding in the end.
So let's start there then. How did you start the cycle and your first tank, if at all? How would you do it now?
I was 14 and dumb, and way back when.
Oh, you were dumb back then too?
Oh, that was dumb back then. I'm dumber back then. I'm dumb now. It's scaled down a little bit. And this is something we never recommend. Not just recommend, we actively suggest against. Never cycle your tank with fish. Ever, ever, ever. It's harmful to the fish. It is harmful, and it is just straight up malicious. Like you're treating the fish like a throwaway fish, and you don't want to do that. Do anything that's taken out of the ocean.
Even worse though, most of the sorry I talked over you. Most of the fish that are kind of recommended anecdotally to be your starter fish are some of the most prone to really bad diseases. So not only are you starting the tank in a less than ethical way, you are setting yourself up for failure because unless you get your fish from a reputable source, and if you buy a chromis to cycle your tank, chromis and damsels are fish in the ocean that can get uranema and spread it to other fish. So you're starting yourself off on the hardest mode possible.
Yeah. That's why they always suggest you get a cheaper fish. You don't want a fish that is expensive to just die.
But you don't want a cheap fish to die either.
Yeah, you don't want any fish to die. The whole goal of the hobby is to get through it with as little fish death as possible. And I have racked up my fish share of frozen Ziploc baggies, if you get that reference. But that's one of the biggest things I would suggest against. Don't cycle with fish. I am a fan of bacteria in the bottle. Turbo Start is really, really good for cycling a tank. I know it's very efficient and it's very potent. Billy, what do you think? How do you cycle your tank?
So I think I did it right. No, I didn't do it right. So when I bought my first saltwater tank, I was in a really stressful time in my life, and I did buy bottled bacteria, but I also bought fish along with it. And I got lucky because I had a friend who basically scolded me and said, okay, well, you're fish in cycling, so you have to do a bunch of water changes and it's going to take way longer than it would have otherwise. I cycled it with Seachem Stability, which is not the best bottled bacteria. It's not the worst, but the bar is really low. Bottled bacteria. Turbo Start by Fritz Aquatics is definitely the higher end of the quality spectrum. My fish were a little bit stressed at first, but they did make it through the first cycle. The cycle took 2 months.
Oh my gosh.
Because when you do water changes to reduce the ammonia to keep your fish less stressed, you're also removing some of the bacteria you're trying to cycle. If I were to start this cycle again, knowing what I know now, I would honestly not even go the bottled bacteria route because there's so many, not snake oils, but there's so many products that are just so diluted that you're basically buying empty bottles of water with maybe 0.01% bacteria in it. What I would do is go to your local fish store, not a Petco, go to a family-owned one. Look in the coral tanks for rock and just ask if you can buy some of the rock. You don't want to buy the quote-unquote live rock that is just a bunch of wet rock in a tank, because that stuff's way overpriced. You want to buy a little bit of rock from an actual ecosystem, so a display tank or a frag tank, and put that in your tank along with all the sand and dry rock and other things. So you basically need a seed crystal for the bacterial biome. But if I was made of money, I would do that and do turbo start.
Enter
Because now, yeah, because you're not only getting a very high density like bacteria populated rock from an established ecosystem, you also want to add bacteria to colonize the sand, the walls, and your filter, and that's what Fritz is best for. Next thing you're gonna have to deal with is salinity. So what was your adventures with salinity, and what would you do now?
When we got the 125, we got the handy dandy old school hydrometer. You know, the little swingy arm instead of a plastic container. And the entire goal was to fill that with water and try to keep it as low as possible. It's so inaccurate, but there's so many variables on what could go wrong with it that it's not recommended that it be used anymore. Nowadays, there's all sorts of electrical salinity testers that pretty cool, because what they do is they send a current out between two probes or 2 points, and depending on how that current reaches the other point, it tells you the salinity of the water itself. What I've recently started using just within the last few months is a glass hydrometer, which, if you don't know, that's like the thermometer equivalent of a salt checker. It actually measures the specific density of the water or the gravity of the water, and through doing that tells you exactly what level your salinity will be at. It's handy. I recommend it to anyone that wants to use it or that is looking for a more accurate way. Because if you're measuring temperature, for example, you can use a thermometer or you can use a electrical tester or sensor or a probe. But in the end, the glass thermometer will tell you more accurately whatever your temperature is more than any probe or electrically calibrated probe.
So you would use not the swing arm hydrometers, but the gravity focused.
Yep, the glass gravity focused hydrometer.
Yeah, okay. So I started with the swing arm too, and calling it a hydrometer is really generous. It'll be precise, but it won't be accurate, if that makes sense. It's going to tell you a number and it's going to read that number consistently, but it will be off by 1 to 2 points of salinity or 1 to 2 points of specific gravity. So if you buy a swing arm hydrometer, and they are very affordable, so you're going to be really motivated to buy that, don't just take the number it shows you for granted. You need to effectively calibrate it against a real salinity measurement tool. So if you're at a local fish store, test salinity, you can bring in a little sample of water and have them check on a refractometer and compare your result to their result and figure out what amount the hydrometer is off by, and just write that in permanent marker on the hydrometer. That's eventually what I did. But for a while, my salinity was 2 points higher than I thought it was, which was fine for the fish relatively. But when I started trying to keep coral, I started having random issues, and I had no idea why, because as far as I knew, my salinity was accurate. What I would do now is I would just use a refractometer. They're probably like $45 to $60, depending on how expensive your fish store is. That's what I would recommend for noobs. Just remember to calibrate it every so often. What I use personally is a gravity-driven glass hydrometer, just like Banana. Do you have the Tropic Marin one?
Yep, that's the exact same that I have. I love it.
What you have to be aware of, and this is true of even the swing arm hydrometers, but hydrometers use gravity to measure, and gravity and density to measure your salinity, and density changes with temperature. So especially when you're in the hot, like the tropical temperature ranges, you need to compensate for whatever temperature your water is when you're measuring. So you have to do a little bit of math. This is why I recommend the refractometer, because you don't need to compensate for temperature there. If you're keeping your water at 78 degrees Fahrenheit or 25 degrees Celsius, it's probably going to be fine, but just keep in mind that there is a little bit of extra math you have to do if you're going to use gravity.
Oh yeah. Refractometers, you brought it up. I didn't say it, but refractometers are also really good to use. The only problem with them is the fact that it's very hard to find a very, very decent calibration fluid to go with it, or one that's consistent. A lot of the times people will say that you can calibrate it with fresh water or you can calibrate it with RODI water, but then you have other people on the other end of the spectrum saying that, hey, it's only accurate to a certain range, and if you calibrate it with RODI water and then you turn a little screw all the way towards a 0, it will no longer be accurate once it's at around 1.025 or 1.026 if you're talking about specific gravity. or 32, 33 if you're talking, or is it 35 when you're talking about ppm?
PPT.
PPT. Yep. What's something that you would do differently, or that you wish you'd done?
I wish I had done that calibration, a quote unquote calibration step when I first had my hydrometer, my swing arm. And that's as easy as measuring on your hydrometer, writing that down, and then bringing in a water sample and having someone with a refractometer or a more accurate testing kit and just figure out what the actual measurement is and then figure out the delta.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Is that what your question was, or do you mean?
Sort of. I mean, like on a different topic. Like, what is something that's
Oh,
differently? Yeah.
Get it. Okay. I was like, I thought I already said that. Okay, ammonia is kind of in line with what we already talked about with the cycle, so I think we can skip that one.
Ooh, patience. That's something that plagued me for years. It took me so long to understand that if you want to run a reef, you need to be patient. A reef was not built in a day. Okay, the Great Barrier Reef was not built overnight. Your tank will not become a reef within a month or within a couple of months. It will take time, and there's nothing you can do to rush that time, right? I mean, everything we do is an attempt to rush it. Bacteria in the bottle is just us saying, "Hey, I don't want to wait 2 months for it to cycle." Back in the day, it was, "Hey, here's all my dry rock. I take a cup of good sand, put it in my tank. I take a good piece of live bacteria covered rock and I put it in my scape, and I wait 2 or 3 months for all the stuff to pass." That might have actually helped because it did teach you patience, but I hated that. I was not a very patient person. I like things to be fast. I wanted my tank to have coral in it as fast as it could. I wanted my tank to have fish in it as fast as it could, and it took me a very, very long time to learn that virtue. You know, the only thing that comes fast in the reef tank is death. That's what I'm gonna say. The only thing that'll happen, yeah.
That's the saying in our hobby: is nothing good happens fast, and it's usually
Nothing good happens fast.
absolutely true.
Nothing good. Yo, the only thing that happens overnight with the coral is bleaching. That's it. Coral won't grow overnight.
Bleaching or like an ammonia spike or
And one, yeah. I mean, usually it's one that's tied to the other. All it takes, since and going back to smaller tanks, right? All it takes sometimes is one colony of an acropora or a torch to RTN. Suddenly, you've got all of that dead tissue in your water. You wake up, you see brown jelly covering it, or you see the entire thing melted overnight. Your ammonia is gonna spike. In a smaller tank, your ammonia will almost guaranteed spike. Your levels will spike, and in certain cases, it could actually cause bacterial blooms that in turn are very dangerous to the health of your fish or to the health of your tank itself. So starting bigger isn't just, hey, I can keep more stuff. It's also, hey, it's easier because, less stuff will affect your tank. There's a much, much greater margin of error than there would be if you were to start with a Pico tank or a 10 gallon or a 20. And a good example of that would be, imagine you're taking a drop of food coloring and you're putting it in a cup versus putting it in a pitcher, or I don't know, a squirt of food coloring, I guess, however you want to word it. But you're gonna see like the red food coloring affect the cup much, much more drastically than you would see it affect the pitcher.
it's a great analogy. I love that.
Yeah, it's the one that I always go with because it's how you explain margin of error in the simplest way possible. Stuff will affect your tank faster. That being said, larger tanks aren't without their faults, but I think for a beginner, starting off with a not so small tank is the best way to go.
Yeah, I think a 40-gallon breeder is like $50 at Petco/PetSmart during their half off sales. They don't do dollar per gallon anymore, and that's relatively cheap. Honestly, the cost per gallon on a smaller tank is way higher for most dimensions, I'm pretty sure. What are your thoughts about lids and like coverage on tanks for beginners? How did you start out, and what do you have now?
I started off with glass lids. My 125 had glass lids, and it was terrible. I'm gonna say right now, glasses are not the way to go. You're gonna deal with evaporational issues. Okay, water will evaporate. It's in the nature of water. It's in the nature of molecules that are in a moving, flowing environment. It's going to happen, and there is no reason to avoid it. You should not avoid it. Don't try to limit evaporation. It is a healthy oxygen exchange. It's a part of a natural cycle of any fish tank. And if you limit it, you will find yourself having pH issues or issues with, just stuff becoming more concentrated. One thing I was noticing was that as water would evaporate, it would kind of settle on the glass lid, and then it would form into these little puddles that would drip down, and then the lids would have algae covering them, or they get really crusty, and I'd have to acid bath them or scrape the algae off. My second tank, I ended up going with these egg crate. I just got egg crate, and I cut the egg crate up. Egg crate, if you don't know, it's like the How do you describe egg crate?
It's like a plastic grid.
Yeah, it's a plastic grid, but in the hobby, it's used for almost everything. It's used as lids, it's used as stands, it is used as covers. It's used to build it. Use it for everything. It's like the Legos of the aquarium community. I built the lid out of it, and then I would take off the lid or work with it. I would put it back on. Now, what I currently have in the 315 gallon is a mesh lid. I 3D printed corners, and using the kits that they gave you to build, screen frame doors, I ended up making my own lid and putting the lid on the canopy. I made 3 of them. 4 of them, just 4 of them. So now it's just a matter of making sure that you have something keeping the fish from jumping, because a fish will jump. Every fish will jump, from a tang to a wrasse, from a goby to a clown. Every single fish has the capacity to jump. I have seen pipefish jump. I have had a 4-inch orange shoulder tank jump, and it actually jumped out of a trap, like onto the back of the tank. So it will jump. Fish will jump. You're gonna want a lid. Mesh is the way to go, and they're becoming more and more available as you go. How about you, Billy? What are your thoughts on that?
I started with an acrylic panel. I tried to switch to netting because I agree with Banana. I wouldn't recommend a solid lid especially for beginners, and especially on a nano tank. But I really didn't like the way it worked. So what I do now is, well, I started with no lid and I lost probably 3 or 4 fish over the course of maybe 4 months, but it was still really, really stressful and sad. I wish I had started with just having a lid on my tank, especially because it was such a small tank. I could have just grabbed an acrylic panel. I did that eventually, but it took me a while. What I have now on my tank is glass panels. I went to Lowe's, I bought a big sheet of glass, and depending on the Lowe's, they have glass cutters. If you find the right one, you can cut the glass for you. So I measured out the dimensions I would need, and I just have a center brace on my tank, so I don't need to put glass there. And I have 2 glass partitions that cover open areas around the brace. But you're gonna have oxygen issues if you do that on a normal tank. So I have a airstone that runs in the corner that has a battery backup, so even if I lose power, there's still an airstone going on, introducing oxygen back into the tank. And I also have an open sump, so there's a lot of oxygen exchange there, and I have a protein skimmer running. So ideally, in an ideal world, I have not only an airstone in my display, but also a protein skimmer and oxygen exchange in my sump. If the power goes off, obviously the return pump stops working, so there's no more oxygenated water coming from the sump, but I have a airstone with that battery backup that'll last up to a day, so I have peace of mind. I do need to clean off the glass lid every now and then, but I refuse to lose another fish to jumping. To gravity, basically.
Yeah, gravity. Carpet surfers, as we call it.
What do you think about that ugly stage?
The ugly stage cannot be avoided, and it should not be avoided. The ugly stage in the hobby is essentially what happens when bacteria are breeding. And bacteria are finally starting to spread throughout your tank. You're going to see things in certain stages that happen. One of them will be a thick layer of diatoms or diatomic bacteria. What these do is they essentially form little strands on your rocks, and they will cover your sand bed, and they'll cover everything. It's natural and it's healthy. It means your tank is getting there. I'd be worried if I set up a tank and I added nothing and I never saw that for the 6 months of reefing, because at some point you realize, hey, why is my tank not cycling? Diatoms are good. Cyano is another phase that happens, this thick red algae, but that's something that's more to do with nutrients being in the proper ranges.
When you start an ecosystem, you basically have to go through the primordial stages that our oceans went through way back before there was life, or back when there was really, really simple life. There was no complex life. So you're going to have a goop battle basically going on in your tank. Different goops are going to fight against each other, and that's okay. You kind of just have to wait it out. It goes back to the patience aspect that Banana brought up earlier. Nothing good happens fast, and that includes fighting off cyano, fighting off diatoms, fighting off dinos. These are just things that will surge in your tank and then go away as your tank matures. And everything, all the money that you spend to accelerate that ugly stage, try to get through it faster, it might work a little bit, but it'll usually do more harm than good. The one thing I recommend to people is if you want to accelerate the ugly stage in a safe way without spending too much money, save some of your bottled bacteria. So either don't use it all or buy enough that you have enough to do 2 doses. And once the ugly stage starts, basically inject with a turkey baster or a pipette, inject that bottled bacteria into whatever starts growing after you do a water change. So siphon out as much of it as you can, siphon out the cyano, disrupt the dinoflagellates, stuff like that. and then reduce the numbers and then replace those numbers with beneficial bacteria that will not necessarily extinguish the nuisance algae and the nuisance bacteria, but will start out competing them. And then you can also buy copepods. Copepods will be live copepods, of course. They'll be really easy to keep, so you don't have to worry too much about your salinity staying the same. And most importantly, they will eat a lot of that algae and that pest bacteria and start reproducing. So you're basically jump starting the microbiome that you want rather than just waiting for that microbiome to build out or spending a lot of money to eliminate those pest algae and that pest bacteria. That is just going to die off anyways. That's what I would do.
It's gonna happen. It's good if it happens. Just wait it out. Just wait it out. Another thing I wish I'd known differently is to not number chase at the very beginning. You don't need to number chase, especially if you have no coral. You don't need a number chase. Not even your pH. The only reason you need to test pH is to know if it's at a dangerous rate, as in like below 7 or above, like 8.5, 8.6.
Yeah, but if you have filter, if you have air exchange, it probably won't be that low. So it's not really something you need to worry about. It's not something that's worrisome enough that you need to buy a test kit for it. If you have a pH test kit already, then you can use it. But temperature, salinity, and ammonia are the only things you need to watch.
Even then, like,
you're not
you don't
chasing.
need. If you wait long enough, you don't need to test ammonia.
Yeah, I think it would be.
But yeah, you should test. You should
It would
test
be
ammonia.
more responsible. Yeah, because the
Yeah.
API kit is good enough. Well, no, I wouldn't get the API one. The
API
Salad test kit is $20,
Mhm.
and that'll last you for hundreds of tests.
You'll never use it again. And then once you think established, the number of times you're testing ammonia goes down drastically, way faster than like it would have taken previously. But yeah, I mean, unless you're living in Chernobyl, you don't need to test pH. You don't need to test any of the other crazy things. Just ammonia as an indicator of where your cycle is at. And even then, if you're starting a tank with cycled rock, if you're starting a tank with like live sand, and you're also pouring in bacteria on top of that, your cycle could be a week long. Like your cycle could go by faster, but there's no guarantee.
And the crazy thing is, even that week will feel like forever, but it'll be such a shorter forever than you would have to deal with if you tried to rush it or didn't rush it in the right way.
Hell yeah, without a doubt. The only downside of that is live rock has a stigma of coming with a lot of nasty stuff on it. I don't think it does. I think it should be fine, but there's always that fear.
Yeah, be smart about it. Just inspect the stuff you're buying beforehand. If you see green hair algae on the rock you're buying, green hair algae is going to be the issue you have next. Luckily, hair algae, which is kind of an addendum to the ugly phase, is a solved problem now, especially if you don't have coral. There's a medication called fluconazole. Or fluconazole. Technically, it's an antifungal, but for some reason, it decimates hair algae populations, especially Bryopsis, but also like the longer, stringier green hair algae. That is something that you shouldn't rush either, though. You shouldn't just dose fluconazole right away because you're going to introduce more spores of the algae in the fish and in the frags and in the rocks you introduce later on in your reefing journey. So what I would do is I would wait 4 or 5 months, just kind of tolerate the algae, and then nuke it with fluconazole.
Unless you're dealing with 100% certified bryopsis, right? Because that will take over everything. Hair algae, just let it grow. It'll manage itself out in the end. And it's not as bad as people make it out to be. Algae's not bad. Algae is not bad.
Yeah, you will hyperfixate on it though. I think that's something that everyone does. We're much more critical of our own tanks and the pests growing therein than we are of anyone else's tank. So try to look past the algae, treat it as basically an affirmation that you are creating an ecosystem. Every ecosystem has algae issues. Our ponds have algae blooms all the time. And as long as they're controlled or they don't like block out all the oxygen, which you will not have an issue with. That happens in nature all the time, and there's no issues. It just gets eaten by the microbiome, and then it goes away.
Knowing how to spot healthy fish. That is something that comes later on, and we're gonna have another episode on this on the road. But knowing how to spot healthy fish is a big one. Knowing that the fish that you're getting is eating when you buy it, and being able to spot some signs of disease. After a certain point, you kind of know which LFS by you has fish that are gonna die, and which ones have fish that are more likely to make it, and you can see it through their practices. But
you have to learn that over time. It's not something that you can really accelerate. But the cheat codes for diagnosing a local fish store's ability to keep and sell you healthy fish is to, like Banana said, make sure it eats in the store. Find an employee, wait for them to quote unquote be available, because obviously they're gonna look busy, they're gonna be changing water or something, but it is their job to show you that their fish are healthy and eating. If they act like that's an unreasonable request, they're gaslighting you. So ignore them, find someone else in the store, or if no one will feed the fish for you, just leave that store because that's a huge red
Just go
flag.
to any store. Yeah, there are many red flags in stores, and I can't wait to talk about that in the next episode.
Ooh, yeah.
But,
Make
yeah.
sure they eat and take a look at photos of the fish online and compare the fish that you're looking at in person to those photos. If you see white dots that aren't there on the model fish, if you see weird white patches or like fading, if the gills look inflamed or red, what other symptoms would you look for in new fish, Banana?
Ooh, they're twitching, or
Mm.
if they're floating kind of dumb, like how do you describe it? If they're not floating upright and you see them slowly leave their side, and then there's like a little push of water, and they'll go back up, and then they'll lay back on the other side slowly. That is a huge red flag. A pinched stomach is also another one.
Yeah, sunken stomach. You will know if a fish is starving. You can kind of just tell, or maybe that's just me. Can you tell when a fish is starving?
You can tell. There's a pinched stomach isn't something that you see until you see it. Until you know until you see it. You can look up pictures of a fish with a pinched stomach, but until you know that you can actually see the stomach, and then you can see the kind of rib bones of the fish, as small as they are, holding their heart, holding their lungs, holding everything, and then behind them it'll kind of look really, really, really skinny, going up until the tail. That's a bad sign.
There's a shape you'd expect a fish to be. If that shape is like concave on the underbelly, then they're starving. They're either starving or they have a parasite or both. So that's something to look for. Flashing is another behavior that you should look for. Flashing is basically the fish version of itching themselves. They'll basically just scrape themselves against sand or rocks or a wall, and that's an indication of parasites or an infection that is irritating them.
And then one thing I'm gonna say, I wish I had done from the very beginning. But I know it's unrealistic to kind of expect everyone to do this, or expect people that don't have the experience to do this. But quarantining fish, I would say that is a very, very big part of the process.
The direction I would lead beginner reefers is to buy pre-quarantined fish
Buying
from a
pre-quarantine
reputable.
fish. Getting fish that are healthy from the very beginning goes a long way. And I know sometimes it's inevitable to get things like ick or, flukes. It will definitely protect you from the nastier things that are out there, like velvet or Brooklynella, or, your anema is a big one. Once you get your anema in your tank, it's not getting out. Unlike the other ones that require a fish host to actually reproduce and breed, your anema can reproduce on the detritus, on rocks. It's a detritivore, so it mainly reproduces on detritus. So once you get your anemia in your tank, it's in there.
And that's the disease that I mentioned is most commonly transported in on damsels and chromis, which are, again, advertised by the hobby for some reason as canary fish that you can just drop in your tank and use to cycle it. So not only is it crazy virulent and will kill fish really quickly, it is really contagious and will stay in your tank forever. So if you want to buy a chromis in the early stages of your tank, you should buy one that's pre-quarantined or put it in a smaller containment tank and just watch it for signs of issues. That's what quarantining is. You're literally just keeping them separate from your main ecosystem and just watching them for signs of issues. And then it's a lot easier to treat them. But again, if you're a beginner and you don't want to buy another 40-gallon or 20-gallon quarantine tank just to start your main tank, there are services out there that will pre-quarantine and treat fish, but they will charge like double to triple the cost of the initial fish. But the peace of mind and the savings of not getting a sick fish and having to buy another one and then having to treat the main tank with whatever they brought into the tank, so ick or uranema or, God forbid, velvet or Brooklynella, all these different diseases, you'll save so much money in the end if you spend that initial extra money just to forego having those issues added to your tank.
100%. I always like to quote, better to pay twice for a quarantine fish. Better to buy quarantine fish for like the price and a half than it is to buy an unquarantined fish like 2 or 3 times, especially with the risks that you run, down the road. And there are cases where you can buy a fish and that fish will come from a tank that has velvet or Brooklynella, and it has actually adapted to survive with it, right? The immune response of that fish is strong enough to survive with it, but that doesn't mean that the fish won't be carrying it. So at some point you will add another fish that does not have it, or you will put that fish in a tank with other fish that don't have it, and their immune response won't be, hey, I can fight this. Their immune response will be, hey, I'm dying tomorrow.
Yeah, it's very much a rabbit hole. Super easy to get to spiral with worry and just freak out whenever your first few fish get sick. But the easiest ways to avoid that are, again, to make sure you're buying a fish that acts healthy in the store and looks healthy in the store, and then putting them in a tank where they are set up for success. So it should be cycled. You should know, by the time you get your first fish, you should know how to maintain the salinity. And ideally, you would want to quarantine it or have someone else quarantine it.
one thing that I would absolutely recommend everyone do is keep their wallet finger closed. The trigger finger. Keep your trigger finger off your wallet. Don't be impulsive. Do not buy impulsively. Impulsive spending, impulsive buying in the hobby will doom you so much further. I absolutely hate when I see a post that says, "Hey, I got this fish. How do I care for it?" That's a very a very bad way to approach it. You should never buy a fish and then try to learn how to care for it. You should learn how to care for the fish before actually getting it.
You should inspect it for infections, slash deformities, slash growths, slash weird behavior. And then you should also know what the fish is and what the care requirements are before you buy it.
Yes, rule of thumb, if you don't know what the fish is, you have no business buying it. If you don't know what the fish is called, don't buy it. Find out about it, go home, do some research, make a post on the forum, ask us here on the server. We'll help you do the best that we can. If it's still available the next day after you think researching and decide, hey, it's a good fit, and if you see it eating and it's healthy, go get it. If it's gone, hey, you know what? Fish in the hobby are frequent. If you're a beginner, the fish that you'll be getting are not going to be like the $2,000 once in a lifetime kind of tangs. It's going to be fish that you're going to inevitably find again.
And you'll not only find it again, you'll find it in a better state than the first
in a
time.
better state. In a better state.
what to
I've
look for.
seen people buy fish because they're like, hey, I really like this tribal blenny. When am I going to see it again? And the answer is, you're going to see it again. That's not the only tribal blenny in the ocean. It's not the only it's not the only wrasse you're gonna ever see. It's gonna be available again down the road. It will be available again. I promise you, you're gonna see that fish again. And if this one's not eating, maybe that one will. Okay, but it's better to wait a little bit, buy the fish once, buy it healthy, than pay for the fish twice, go through the stress of having one die, and then buying another one. Doing it all for the risk of saying, hey, maybe it'll live, it's just not worth it. It's not worth it.
Yeah, it all goes back to patience. Being patient enough to see a fish that looks cool, find out what it is. I have done so much Googling in fish stores, there's no shame in it. I have done that while working at the store. I will pull out my phone and Google something that someone asks a question about and try to give them a good idea, but also encourage them to Google it themselves. Figure out what it is, wait, learn, and especially learn what to look for in terms of health.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Let it out. We're going to do an episode down the road about how to properly research for the hobby. Because there's so much back and forth and back and forth and back and forth information.
Ooh, that is one thing I want to touch on for beginners. You want one or two inputs for information. You do not want to basically ask the entire world, what do I do with this reef tank? Or what do I do with this issue? Or how do I deal with this algae? Find someone who has an established tank and ask them your questions. And maybe do that to 2 people, but don't do it to more than 2 people, because you basically need to copy what someone else does. And you can't do that if you're asking 15 different people. That'll happen in our server all the time. If you're getting too many people responding to your question with different answers, it's going to be a lot harder to choose the right path forward.
Too many cooks.
Yeah.
Too many cooks. Way too many cooks. Too many cooks. Too many cooks. We're going to get sued. Don't get cheap testing equipment, is what I would recommend at the beginning. Don't not, no matter what you do, okay, no matter what you do not get, and I don't know why they sell it. They sell it because people buy it, but do not buy the API Master Reef Test Kit. The one that comes with the calcium, that comes with alkalinity, the one that comes with everything. You don't need that. You do not need that.
Yeah, get ammonia at most, and don't get the API ammonia because it's really bad for saltwater. Get the Salifert one. Or
Salifert is a trusted brand. Salifert is a brand that comes in consistently. It is relatively affordable, It's not the cheapest test kit. That's why API is always out there. They're cheap, but you're getting what you pay for. You're getting exactly what you pay for. It is cheap, and tanks have crashed because of it. We're gonna get sued
now,
again.
don't get me wrong. They do bring reefing chemistry to a lot more people than Salifert. Like API is way more well distributed, and it's not going to be completely wrong. Like they're not selling snake oil. It does technically test the things you're trying to test. There's a lot of stuff in that kit that you don't need, and it's going to be off by a certain amount just because of the vast volume that they're producing these test kits at. They lose a little bit of accuracy. So start with Salifert, get into Salifert ammonia, and some reasonably calibrated way to measure salinity, and those are the 2 test kits that you need.
That's all you need to start with. That's all you need. Until you start keeping coral, you do not need another test kit. And I'll say it again.
Yeah, very true. That's all I got. Do you have anything else?
Reefing apps are helpful. I wish I got the reefing app from the very beginning. They are very helpful. There are apps out there, or aquarium apps altogether, There are apps out there where you can document your livestock, document your equipment, document your parameters.
Reefing apps, there's a lot of them out there. Do you have one that you would recommend?
I love Aquariumate. I have been a huge advocate for Aquariumate. I know they recently came out with they were absent for the longest time. Like they were dormant. But even in that still dormant stage, the app is amazing. It's available everywhere. You can access it on your computer, you can access it on your phone, you can access it on your tablet. This is not an ad. I just really like the app. The only thing I dislike about the app is the lack of updates. They did recently update on the iOS, so if you're on iPhone or on iPad, they had an update out for that, but the Windows and the Android are still to be updated.
I mean, if you struggle to find an app that has everything you need, you can literally just use a notebook, like a pen and paper.
Pen and paper or Excel. Even Excel works.
Ooh, yeah. The way you want to use this as a beginner is you want to, again, document the fish that you have if you need to, but the most important thing is to track your parameters over time. It'll be especially helpful for salinity. Tracking the ups and downs of your salinity is a really fast way to figure out how to do your top off. Like you're gonna know basically what your evaporation rate is, so you can dial in whatever top off system you use. Even if it's gravity fed, you know how often you're gonna need to replace the top off water. If it's an ATO, you can kind of dial in the usage rates, and you can kind of identify when things are going wrong if your ATO isn't functioning properly. And most importantly, you know the range of salinity that your reef tank is staying in. Data is really powerful, especially because if you can see data over time, if you're patient enough to populate that data, you're going to learn so much more about the habits and patterns of the hobby, and you're going to become a much more successful reefer as a result.
Data carries.
It's a really good.
Data carries. Yeah. It's all data. All that reefing is data. What do you say is one of the easier fish to keep for beginners?
Get a $20 clownfish. Once your tank is ready, if you, again, make sure it eats in the store and check it for visible issues or parasites, whatever. Most clownfish that you're going to see in a shop are captive bred, so they've been in an aquarium their entire life. They are ready for the salinity swings that you're probably still going to be having even when your tank is cycled, and they're really freaking cute. So that's what I would start with.
Clownfish are...
What would you start with?
I would also say clownfish because they're friendly. They're not too crazy. You know, they're not going to be...
So you have to say something else.
Okay. If I was going to say something else, another fish that's not a clownfish that's also very easy to begin with, Lamor blenny. Is a very, very fun beginner fish.
And they're great because, I mean, they're advertised as algae eaters. We're going to have another podcast episode where we focus more on quote-unquote algae eater fish as a trope. But what they really do is they rasp at the rocks. They're going to eat whatever they rasp, but it's really beneficial to have something rasping on your rocks early on in your tank's life cycle, because that will help disrupt the buildup of cyano. It'll help disrupt the buildup of new green hair algae, and they're really cute. But they are prone to jumping. So again, if you're going to get one, make sure you have a mesh lid, ideally.
How about inverts? What's an invert you would recommend?
I don't really recommend them for beginners. I had a lot of issues with my first few inverts. I mean, hermit crabs you can't really go wrong with. Nearite snail. The first thing I would get is a nearite snail. What about you? Yeah, it's hard, right? There's too many options.
There's a lot of them out there. Hermit crabs are really good beginner fish. Or inverts. Beginner inverts.
Sure, when you buy them in the store, though, that you can actually see that there's a hermit crab in the shell. The number of times I've spent money on empty shells when I'm just buy hermit crabs.
And it's just the shell. Yeah, without a doubt.
That just can. What's a quote unquote beginner fish that you would not recommend?
A mandarin dragonet. I know you had this in mind. A mandarin dragonet. A lot of people buy them. They're not crazy expensive. They're like $35, $40, but they are very difficult to keep alive if you have an unestablished or newer tank. Their main source of food is pods. Small invertebrates that you see crawling on the glass. Very small, like 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter in diameter. If you don't have a good establishment of those, you will not have a good time keeping them alive. Now, that is to say, they do sell them tank bred nowadays. They do sell them that do mainly feed on myces. But in the end, a good community of pods in your tank will go a long, long way.
Yeah, and so not only will your tank not have enough copepods to keep a mandarin dragonet happy and fed and full, the mandarin, you want those pods in your tank to help you combat with the ugly stage. So even if you have pods in your tank to begin with, you don't want to have a Mandarin Dragonette in there. It's going to starve, and while it starves, it's going to eat the few pods that are fighting off the cyano, the diatoms, the dinos, and the microalgae. So it's just overall not a great idea.
Not a great idea at all.
The captive bred ones are harder to find. I haven't seen at least an advertised biota or ORA Mandarin Goby in a while. So if you can find them, you could grab one, but it's a really risky buy. The beginner fish that I quote unquote beginner fish that I would not recommend to folks is, well, I have two of them. One is the chromis. We already kind of covered that. They come in really sick. They're really cheap, so people, the fish stores just buy them in bulk. And when you're buying it in bulk, they're more prone to disease. They're more prone to being underfed. And they're just overall a deceptively tricky fish. The other one that we haven't covered that I do want to bring up is the dory fish. Finding Nemo lied to us. Not all dories act like the one in the movie, and they are really, really difficult to keep in a new aquarium. Not only do they get 2 feet long over the course of 3 or 4 years, but they also come in really sick, usually.
Very skinny. They come in very, very skinny. A lot of the times people will buy them, they'll be die within the next month or so, and guess what? You're stuck bringing another dory.
Yeah, and they're like crazy overpriced, obviously, because of the movie. So if you want to have a dory in your tank along with your Nemo, if your kid is demanding it, or if you just really want to recreate that movie, find a lookalike. Find a are there lookalikes?
Really? The damsel would be similar.
The yellowtail damsel. But again, they're gonna have issues. So use caution if you're buying a yellowtail damsel. A cherub pygmy angel is a really cute. They kind of look similar. It's a really big stretch.
They're out there. It's a stretch, yeah. But a kid's not gonna know the difference.
Yeah. Just say it's a dory and slap yourself with it.
Dory's cousin dory.
And set a stretch goal for your hobby to eventually keep a dory when you are educated about what they need, how to find a healthy one, and how big they're gonna get, because they get huge.
They like algae, like all tangs. I have one now. They're not called dory fish. Their main term is a hippo tank or a regal tank, and they mainly eat algae. All tangs are mainly herbivores. They like to graze. They spend their entire time grazing. So if your tank's not established and you're not growing algae, you're not gonna have a good time with this fish.
A disclaimer to add to that is they're not going to eat the algae that you want them to.
Nope.
They need a specific type of turf algae, or they need seaweed. And you're not going to be able to provide that in a basic new tank. They're not going to eat the algae for you. They're not going to help you through the ugly phase. They will just struggle and starve. So be really careful. Banana has a lot of tanks. He's a tank expert. He quarantines, and he has a huge tank. I would not recommend for anyone other than someone with a banana tank to get a hippo tank.
They get big. They swim a lot. They swim a lot more than people think they do. Most people spend their entire lives in the wild just grazing, and they don't swim in the span of like 30 inches by 30 inches. Right? In the wild, like you see tanks grazing, and they'll cover areas that are like
5 square miles.
Square miles in their entire lives. You're not gonna have a tank that big in your house.
So be really, really critical of recommendations you get for quote unquote beginner fish. Lawnmower Blenny and the standard Ocellaris clownfish are really good starting points. And if it's anything other than those 2 fish, do a lot of research. Take your time, be patient. The fish will show up again. There are millions, probably billions of that fish in the ocean. So don't rush it.
Don't rush it. There's no need to rush. Patience is virtue. And with that, we're gonna go into the myth of the day. The myth of the day that we have is something that a lot of people struggle with in the very beginning, because a lot of people either they're coming in from freshwater and they're saying, hey, everything's a lot cheaper there. I don't have the money for like a $300 skimmer. I don't have the money for like a $300 light, $800 for a single light. Or you have the other end of the spectrum where you have people coming in who have never owned fish at all. At which point they're saying, no, I'm not paying $500 for a fish tank. Right? But the reality is that you don't need a lot of money to have a successful tank. You don't need thousands of dollars to have a flourishing reef. You can have a gorgeous tank at a decent size. All it takes is patience and a little bit of hunting.
I do think this topic is worthy of its own episode.
It is.
So we might do another, we might expound on this in a future episode, but for now, we basically just need to dispel this myth that reefing is expensive. If you want to go,
just cut that out. Yeah, we just cut that out. Choose a different myth. What's a good myth? Algae isn't bad.
Ooh, yeah.
Algae isn't bad. Algae is not bad. If you're starting out, you're gonna see algae, you're gonna freak out. Algae isn't a bad thing to have in your tank. Algae is a sign of a healthy tank. It's a sign of a prosperous tank, and it is a sign that, hey, your tank is ready to the next level. To the next level.
Yeah, very true. A lot of people came into my fish store back when I worked at one asking for algae eaters because they said, oh, my tank has algae, I don't want that, and I'm going to get a critter specifically to eat the algae and hopefully kill it off. First of all, it's not going to eat the algae you want, and second of all, it will never eradicate algae from your tank. There's algae in the wild still, despite billions of years of quote-unquote algae eaters living in the ocean. You can't eradicate it. It's too prolific, and you're going to spend so much of your life, and so you're going to invest so much energy in an impossible goal. So learn to see past the algae and watch the ecosystem that's growing around the algae, and don't spend too much time getting rid of it. If it does get out of control to the point where it's like blocking out the light or starving out your corals, we've already covered a couple ways that you can address it using reef fluconazole or nutrient control.
Yeah, and this is something you don't really look at or think about till later on. But algae actually works as an indicator of a healthy tank.
Yeah.
I know when I see my tank, if I see no film algae growing for 2 days in a row, or for a day, if I see no film algae growing in the glass whatsoever, I know that something's off. And as I start testing my water, I end up finding that something is off. Something is always off when there's no film algae. It's a sign of a healthy tank. It's a sign of a good tank.
Yeah, a lack of algae is a red flag. So you're pursuing not only something that's technically impossible, you're pursuing something that's technically impossible unless your tank is dying.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you zoom into any part of the food chain, every single evolutionary line of critters, if you go far enough down, they eat algae. It's a microalgae, it's a turf algae, it's a floating phytoplankton that's technically an algae, or it's diatoms. So you need it in your tank.
You need it, you want it, don't get rid of it, don't be afraid of it.
Embrace the algae.
Embrace it. And with that, thank you for listening to our podcast today. This is episode 2 signing off. I can't believe we did a second one. Hopefully there'll be a third one.
Yeah.
Hopefully, API doesn't come sue us and Network doesn't defame us, destroy his site.
I think we walked it back. They sell enough. They don't care about us.
Yeah, they don't care. We're a drop in the water.
All right, we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone. Thank you for listening to another episode of Slice of the Reef,
your number one podcast for all things fishy, with your hosts, Giancarlo and Billy. Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that podcasts are held. That way, you'll never miss an episode. If you want to be a part of our podcast, join us on discord.xyz/Slice of the Reef, where we'll be recording in front of a live audience. We also give you a moment at the end of every episode for a live Q&A session, and we're very interactive with our fans. So we'd love for you to join. You can also check out our website for articles, guides, calculators, and information on our upcoming episodes at sliceofthereef.org. Hope to see you guys soon.
Farewell and easy reefing.